Well then, now, here we are, talking about a system that pretends not to see. That's what it is. Look, people keep telling me that the system works. They say family courts are here to protect children. And that's the official story, at least, anyway. That's the brochure version, at least, anyway. The version that sounds nice on government websites. But if you've actually been through it, if you've lived inside the machinery, you know something different. You know that it's not a system of truth. It's a system of narratives. And whoever controls the narrative controls the outcome. Let me tell you something. If someone wants to remove a father from a child's life in England and Wales, they don't need evidence. They just need an allegation. Because the moment an allegation appears, the machine freezes, contact stops, safeguarding checks in, months turn into years, and while the system slowly decides whether the allegation is true, the child grows up without their father. I know this because it's happened to me. Years of my daughter's life gone. Not because I was proven dangerous, not because there was evidence, but because an allegation existed. And the court system is terrified of one thing above everything else: being blamed later. So the safest decision for the court is often the most destructive decision for the child. Delay, pause, investigate. And in that delay, relationships decay. Let me tell you the part nobody wants to talk about. You can win your case. You can prove the allegations were nonsense. You can get 50-50 contact. You can walk out of court technically vindicated, and it still doesn't give you those years back. You don't get the missed birthdays back. You don't get the Christmas mornings back. You don't get the childhood memories back. Justice arrives like a doctor who finally shows up after the patient has already been buried and bled to death. And then there's the other side of the story, the one the system struggles to even recognize: male victims of domestic abuse, because the framework of the system still runs on the assumption that man equals risk, women equals victim. Reality is messier than that, much messier. The system hates messy reality. Systems prefer simple categories. So what happens when a father is protecting his child from a violent household? What happens when that violence is coming from the mother's partner? What happens when the mother refuses to engage with domestic abuse services? You would assume that the system would react strongly. You'd assume protection would come first. But instead, the narrative shifts. Suddenly it becomes parental conflict. Conflict. A neat bureaucratic word that neutralizes everything. Violence becomes conflict. Safeguarding becomes communication issues. And the father raising concerns becomes part of the problem. Meanwhile, the children live in the middle of it all. They see the violence. They report the concerns. The school tells the mother. The father's kept out of the loop. And when he raises safeguarding issues, the professionals say both parents need to reduce conflict. Let me translate that into plain English. The person raising the alarm gets treated the same as the person starting the fire. And then there's the courtroom itself, a place that supposedly runs on precision and accuracy. But sometimes the orders written after the hearing doesn't all even reflect what was said in the court. A solicitor drafts it up, it gets stamped, signed, filed, and suddenly the illegal reality exists that nobody in the room actually ordered. Trying to correct it? Oh yes, what you need to do, try and correct it. Emails disappear into administrative black holes. Phones ring unanswered. And meanwhile, the order stands. Because once the bureaucracy starts moving, it rarely turns around to admit a mistake. Now here's the uncomfortable truth. Most of the people inside the system aren't evil. They're not villains. They're overwhelmed professionals inside an overloaded machine. Social workers with impossible caseloads. Judges with 10 minutes per family. Schools terrified of making the wrong call. So the system develops the survival habits, shortcuts, assumptions, heuristics. And those assumptions quietly shape outcomes. One of those assumptions is this: if we treat fathers cautiously, we avoid risk. If we treat mothers cautiously, we risk criticism. So guess which direction the system leans. And over time, something strange happens. Not because of conspiracy, because of inertia. Patterns become culture. Culture becomes policy. Policy becomes how things are done. And suddenly, everyone is participating in a system that nobody would design from scratch. Now, here's the hardest part to say out loud. Even when the system eventually corrects itself, it never repairs the damage. It cannot restore lost time. It cannot rebuild broken bonds. And it certainly can't apologize, because bureaucracies do not apologize. They simply move on to the next case. So when people say trust the system, what they really mean is trust the machine that moves slowly, assumes cautiously, and rarely admits an error. A machine that might eventually produce the right outcome after childhood has already been half over. And the real tragedy, not that the system tries to protect the children, but it should. The tragedy is that sometimes, in trying to avoid risk, the system becomes the one thing that quietly steals the very childhood it claims to protect. Corruption within family court is real. Not with everyone, but it's real. And it's real enough that I see it. It's real enough that I'm seeing it and experiencing it and living it. They gaslight you. They make you question your own worth. So there's my rant for today. Right, at least I've got that rant over. So let me tell you a little bit more about a little story. Let me tell you a little story. During the summer of 1999, I met an older man we'll call him Pickering Ronald. At first, I liked him. He was sort of tall, thin, grey hair, sort of old man who looked like he'd lived enough life to have some wisdom in him, you'd think. Didn't really grow up with much of a father figure, so I think I projected something onto him. I respected him. I admired him. He even helped me build my confidence driving, get back on the bike and whatever, after crashing my bike. And that meant something to me. At first, he seemed like one of these older men who had stories, insight, experience, someone who could learn from. But the more time I spent with him, around him, the more the shine come off. His stories started repeating themselves. And when they repeated, parts would change. At first, I brushed it off. He was older, dementia, you know how it is. You think, fair enough, memory slips. But after a while, you realize it's not just forgetfulness. Sometimes people aren't remembering, they're editing. They're retelling themselves into a version they can live with. He had a partner. I call her Cherry Pie. She was very much younger than him, around my age. And she had this dramatic, unstable energy about her. Small, loud, theatrical, like Oompa Loompa, like kind of person who doesn't really just enter the room, but colonizes it. Like Donald Trump. There was something about her that's off from the start. One night, I saw them arguing. She was on the phone, crying like her world was ending, and she turned up in person, and suddenly there was no tears. Then a moment later, the tears were back. It was like watching the tap that switched on and off. Then that's it. That's when I really saw it. I thought some people, for them, emotion, like, it doesn't really work for them. Does that make sense? So emotion isn't really something they feel. It's more something they use. And Cherry Pie had a grip on Pickering Ronald, proper grip. She'd been with a neighbour before him, then somehow found her way into Ronald's bed once he realised he had some money and security. So the whole thing looked less like romance and more like an opportunism with the side of performance. Still, he went along with it. He was happy because old men don't stop being vain, do they? Just because they go grey, sometimes they get worse. The body starts dying and the ego panics, clearly. Now, Ronald also had this attachment to 300 children who weren't biologically his, but he'd been around them as in a grandfather role for years. And to be fair, that part did seem genuine. He cared for them, but it also felt like he was trying to live out something he'd missed in his own life. He hadn't managed to properly parent them, his own child, so he was now pouring himself into the second-hand version of his family, trying to reclaim a lost identity from somebody else's children, if that makes sense. The children belonged to a woman called Tilmore. Tilmore is important because she is really the center of this whole mess. She's the mother of these 300 children, and she's also the one who is being beaten by the cowboy, the man she was involved with after the father of the children. This cowboy was violent, not just difficult, not just rough around the edges, violent. He assaulted her, hospitalized her. He held a knife to her. Had all sorts of chaos happen in front of the children. So when people talk about drama, this wasn't just gossip and raised voices. This was real damage, real fear, real instability with children standing there absorbing every second of it. And the father of the children, I'll call him King of Denmark, stepped in and took the children into his care. And honestly, from what I could see, the part made sense. That part made real sense. He wasn't perfect, but he was trying to create stability in a situation that had become dangerous and unhinged. Tilmore, though going back to the cowboy, kept getting dragged back into the orbit, and, that just deepened up and the whole disaster got worse. That's where Pickering Ronald enters the mess more seriously. He had fallen out with the King of Denmark over words, nothing major, handbags, pride, whatever it was just a verbal clash. Because grown adults are often just wounded children with bills and blood pressure medication, that little fracture became a whole alliance shift. Ronald started sliding more with Tilmore. But I don't think it was purely out of compassion. I think it was about access to the children, the 300 children. Part of it was about resentment towards the King of Denmark, but the other part of it was own was his own important part of his own story. And then, as always happens in these systems, they started trying to pull me in. No, that's what they never wanted. I'm not built for joining these tribal little wars. I don't want to carry messages, pick sides, validate delusions, or become a witness in somebody's version of reality. I worked with the father, the King of Denmark, yes, but that didn't mean I wanted to become the weapon in everyone else's domestic psychodrama. No. But once you're nearby, people try to recruit you, because that's what chaos does. It expands, it feeds, it wants witnesses, allies, converts. And while all this is going on, there were moments that made the whole thing feel even darker. Strange comments, inappropriate undertones, vulnerable children in the middle of unstable, manipulative adults. That's the part that sticks in my mind, because once children are in the blast of radius, that radius, this stops being messy people with issues. It becomes something like morally rotten. And that's what stuck with me was most of this was some of these people were old enough to know better, old enough to have learned, old enough to have seen the consequences, and still kept feeding the fire. More grievance, more alliances, more ego, more drama, as if they couldn't see that the children were the ones who'd pay the price. And that's the part I can't get over. From where I stood, the pattern was obvious, the danger was obvious, the manipulation was obvious, the destruction was obvious. And yet everyone inside it behaved like it was, they were following some noble cause, when really they were just serving their own wounds, their own appetites, resentments, and need for control. That's what disturbed me. That's what disturbs me. Not that people are flawed. That's normal. We're all flawed. No one's perfect. That they can be standing in a burning house, literally burning the house down, holding the petrol can, and still insist they're the voice of reason. What's actually going on underneath that Tilmore is correctly placed in the whole structure is clearer. Pickering Ronald, he isn't a wise older elder. He's a man trying to escape irrelevance. I saw a father figure in him. He saw an audience. Later, I discovered, well, the old tragedy, age often makes people more desperate, not more noble. He wants significance, youth nearby, children to attach to, and a role in the drama. Cherry Pie, she looks like a classic destabilizer. Emotional display as leverage, chaos as control, opportunism, dressed up as vulnerability. Not mysterious, just effective. Some people don't solve insecurity, they weaponize it. Tilmore, the mother of the 300 children, she's not just the problem and not just the victim. She's a damaged center of gravity. She's been abused, and that matters because that abuse doesn't magically turn someone into a saint. Victims can still become participants in a destructive system, especially when trauma scrambles judgment and repetition becomes normal. She is tragic, but tragedy still has consequences for the children. And the cowboy, he's like a blunt instrument, like in the story. Less subtle than the others, just naked dominance, violence, fear. He's the one who makes the whole thing unmistakably serious because his behavior strips away the polite fiction. Once there's actual abuse in front of children, the moral picture sharpens. That's the cowboy. And then you've got the King of Denmark. He is the stabilizer, though not necessarily a perfect one. The important distinction is this: imperfect is not the same as dangerous. In family systems, people often confused "I dislike him" with "he is the villain." Those are not the same sentence. Me, the observer, who thought I was entering a relationship with people and discovered I'd actually walked into a live psychological minefield. That's why it felt so maddening. I wasn't just hearing gossip. I was watching the ecosystem of trauma, ego, dependency, and manipulation trying to recruit me. Why did no one see what I see? Because seeing clearly would cost them too much. Pickering Ronald, well, he would have to admit he's not the wise old patriarch, just as an aging old man hungry for relevance. Cherry Pie would have to admit that manipulation is her method, not bad luck. Tilmore would have to admit that being harmed doesn't erase the harm. She enables it by staying in destructive cycles. The cowboy would have to admit control and virtue are not always identical, and all of them would have to admit that the children are being shaped by their selfishness. That is too expensive psychologically. So instead, everyone buys a cheaper story. I'm hurt. I'm only reacting. I'm doing my best. I had no choice. Human beings are allergic to the sentence, I helped create this. At the core of this, and the real lesson underneath this, is people do not mature simply because time passes. They just become an older version of whatever they were and whatever they refuse to confront. So the old man becomes an older narcissist. The traumatized woman becomes a traumatized chaos engine. And the manipulator becomes a more polished manipulator. The violent man becomes violent and with wrinkles or muscle. And the children inherit the bill. And that's the bleak comedy of it all. Everyone wants innocence. No one wants responsibility. And then they all stare at the wreckage as if it has arrived by weather.